buttons here, and then pointer there.
All right, thanks, Scott. As the title states, and as Scott just stated, I am going to focus on a geophysical overview of the landslide disaster that occurred near the small town of Oso, Washington last March 22nd, with a particular focus on landslide mobility and work that my colleagues and I have been doing to try to understand that mobility. I think it's easy to make the case that the Oso landslide was the most important landslide in U.S. history. It was obviously very important from a practical standpoint in that it caused 43 fatalities. That's the second most of any individual landslide in U.S. history. But equally important from a scientific perspective is that it was an extraordinarily mobile landslide and affords an unusually good opportunity to understand high mobility landslides because of the exceptionally good documentation of the event. A very simple mobility index that most of you are probably familiar with is this H/L index, which is just the ratio of the total vertical descent distance to the total horizontal extent of the landslide path. And if you're familiar with these values, you'll recognize immediately this value of 0.1 is very small, particularly for a landslide of this size, about 8 million cubic meters. So before going into more detail regarding mobility, I want to provide just a bit of background information. The Oso location is about 80 kilometers northeast of Seattle in the Cascade Range foothills. A lot of discussion has taken place subsequent to the event about what caused or what triggered the event. I think that that's a very difficult thing to ascertain and probably never will be known with great precision, as is true for most landslides. What can be said without question is that it had been exceptionally wet in the period leading up to the landslide. There's too much data in this table, I think, to process entirely in this brief time, so I'd just like to point to the two highlighted rows of information here, which show, for example, that the 45 days leading up to the March 22nd landslide date were wetter than about 98% of all preceding 45-day intervals in a record that dates back to 1927 from a rain gauge at the nearby community of Darrington. And interestingly, the 4-year period extending through March this last spring was the wettest such 4-year period on record. So it had been wet, no question, and there's little doubt but that pore pressures in the landslide were high, even though we'll never know the details. From a geological perspective, the site was very predisposed to landsliding. That had been well known for some time. This is a segment of a geologic map that was done by the Washington Department of Natural Resources based on fieldwork in the 1990s and published in 2003. Here, that geologic map is draped over a 2013 LiDAR image. The area circled in red is the source area for the landslide this last spring. And you can see that there are all kinds of adjacent areas of Holocene landslide deposits. These are all developed within a sequence of glacial outwash sediments, also including some till units, and at the base of that stratigraphic sequence, a glacial lacustrine silt and clay unit. All these units, to varying degrees, were involved in the landslide. Another point I'll make in passing is that not only was this well known from the standpoint of long-term landslide activity, but this site had also been subject to landsliding several times in the last 50 or 60 years. And so it was a well-known site of slope instability. However, all previous episodes of landsliding on this site had been rather modest in scope. The most recent event prior to this last spring was a landslide that occurred in 2006. It's known locally as either the Steelhead landslide or the Hazel landslide, depending on whose account you read. In the case of that landslide, it did in fact cross the course of the Stillaguamish River at that time, relocated the river to some degree, but really did not exhibit an anomalously long run out in terms of its H/L value. And that had been true of other previous landslides at this site. I should also note in passing that it was our great good fortune from a scientific standpoint that this area had been flown with LiDAR in 2013, so we had excellent pre-event topographic data, which was really important for a lot of the work we did subsequent to the event. So this is the way the landscape was transformed during the landslide last March 22nd, showing the overall extent of the deposit here with this outer yellow line. In this simplified map, we've identified just a few basic depositional units within the landslide. The major unit we're calling a debris avalanche deposit. It has all of the characteristics of classic debris avalanche deposits, whether very large ones of the scale of Mount St. Helens in 1980 or smaller debris avalanches elsewhere, but classic hummocky terrain and other features that are indicative of what are normally called debris avalanches. At the distal end of the deposit is a unit that we've called a debris flow veneer deposit. It has all the characteristics of a classic, fully liquefied Pacific Northwest debris flow, heavily freighted with wood, and in this case also heavily freighted with the remains of civilization as it existed on this segment of this floodplain. I want to emphasize that although this debris flow veneer deposit has an impressive size in terms of its planimetric area, it's for the most part a very thin deposit and makes up only a few percent of the total volume of the landslide, so relatively unimportant from the overall perspective of landslide dynamics. And then there are some upper units, this large rotational slump block left stranded in the source area, and a secondary small debris flow coming off the headscarp subsequent to the main event. So returning now to this concept of mobility and H over L, of course, this takes on more meaning, I think, when viewed in vertical cross-section as shown here. So here are both before and after topographic profiles of the landslide site, the distal limit of the runout. When translated into a runout angle, or a Farbauchung, as was originally coined by Heim to describe this sort of thing, the angle here is about 6 degrees, which again is surprisingly small for a landslide of this size. Equally interesting, I think, at this site is the fact that the source area was not steeply sloping. Typically high-speed, long runout landslides originate on steep mountainsides, generally speaking greater than 30 degrees, often 40 or 50 degrees. This was a relatively modest slope that on average was less than 20 degrees. It was not a steep mountainside where this originated. It was better really described as a riverside bluff, about 180 meters in height. So in order to put mobility in context, since data compilations looking at mobility are almost always based on volumes of landslides, one of the first things one needs to do to put this in context and also to do any modeling of this landslide is to define its volume and the nature of the source area. To determine the landslide volume, it's impossible to do so by simply differencing the before and after LiDAR data, because there was a considerable quantity of landslide debris left behind in the source area, covering part of the original slip surface. So in order to estimate the volume, what we did was to reconstruct the shape of the basal slip surface within this source area, the lateral limits of the source area being well defined by the post-event LiDAR data. We drew 5 longitudinal transects across that source area, and then constructed alternative sets of slip surface profiles along those transects, then joined those profiles into smooth 3D slip surfaces. So this shows 3 different sets of alternatives along the 5 transects. There's sort of our minimal volume estimate here of about 7 million cubic meters, our maximum estimate of about 9 million, and our intermediate estimate of about 8 million, and we've chosen to go with 8 million as the most reasonable estimate. All of these slip surfaces are constrained at their upper ends by actual data, by the post-event LiDAR data, so that is firmly anchored at the top. At the bottom ends, they're constrained by essentially an assumption we made, which is that the landslide terminated flush with the bank of the river. We don't know for certain that that's the case, but that's a very common scenario with riverside landslides. And then we joined the upper constraint to the lower constraint by assuming that a slip surface had more or less the shape of a logarithmic spiral, which is a preferred shape for landslide slip surfaces based on plasticity theory. So with our volume estimate of 8 million cubic meters in hand, we can then compare the OSO to other events elsewhere to try to put it in context. So here's a large body of data for landslides worldwide, where the reciprocal of H over L is plotted as a mobility index as a function of landslide volume. All the data, well, all prior data that I have found in the literature for events that have been called debris avalanches, rock slides, and so forth, they all plot below this upper bound line shown in orange. And the Oso event actually plots slightly above that line, indicating that this was, based on its volume, a truly exceptionally mobile event. Now you can see that there are other data that plot above the line, but these are for entirely different kinds of events. For the most part, large channelized debris flows, lahars in particular, that originate on volcanoes. And of course, in the case of a lahar and most debris flows, their mass and momentum is strongly channelized in the downslope or downstream direction by topography. They basically follow topography and thereby run out further than they would otherwise. In the case of the Oso event, there was no channelizing topography. It simply spread out across an essentially flat floodplain. And that's one of the reasons that I view the Oso event as being so anomalous in terms of its run-out distance. So in order to understand mobility, it turns out that in this case, the problem or puzzle posed by mobility is sort of intertwined with the puzzle of what was the sequence of events precisely as the landslide began, as the whole thing unfolded. There's some evidence within the deposits. Again, here's our sequence of basic units, this distal debris flow veneer deposit. This was a photo taken just a few days after the event. You can see how here's a debris avalanche hummock actually protruding up through that debris flow veneer deposit. Here's the bulk of the debris avalanche deposit, and then this large slump block left behind stranded in the source area. Here's a view of the same set of units, this time from the top down, from the headscarp, the slump block, the debris avalanche, the debris flow veneer, and then this secondary debris fall that onlaps onto the slump block deposit. So the question is, what was the sequence of events here that gave rise to this set of depositional units? Well, one of the best constraints we have comes from an eyewitness report. There were a number of eyewitnesses to the event, but this particular individual had a remarkably good view in that he was outdoors at the time the event occurred. It was a clear sunny morning. He was standing on a fluvial terrace with a clear view overlooking the floodplain here and the entire runout path of the landslide. I was able to interview him at length the week immediately following the event, and then subsequently my colleagues interviewed him as well. So we probably have a total of about 10 hours of conversation time with this individual. And he gave a quite cogent report of what happened, although he could not actually see the landslide source area because that part of his view was blocked by terrain and trees. What he described was sort of a two-stage unfolding of events. He was first alerted to the event by a loud noise, a very loud noise, which he described as being like low-flying jet aircraft. He looked around for the source of that noise and could see nothing. He looked out over the floodplain, for example, saw nothing happening in the vicinity of the river or the floodplain. That noise went on for some tens of seconds, and then it actually started to diminish. And at that point, he actually turned around, turning his back on the floodplain, walking in the other direction. And then he was alerted to something else happening by a still larger noise. And he describes himself turning around, looking, and what he observed, he characterized as a mountain of turbulent earth, 100 feet over his head, moving past at 100 miles an hour. Now, of course, you can take those numbers with a grain of salt, but the point is that there were some tens of seconds that passed between the original onset of activity and then this rush of high-speed debris across the floodplain. At that time, he also described the river being thrown into the air by the landslide, which is important, I think, for understanding how the distal debris flow originated. So with that kind of eyewitness information in hand, that helps inform or, in other ways, test seismological interpretations of the sequence of events. And at first, this was very puzzling to us, the seismic record, because at first blush, looking at essentially raw seismic data, it appeared that there were two rather distinctive events roughly 4 minutes apart in time in terms of their onset times based on this high-frequency ground shaking. However, using methodology that's fairly well established in the literature, and this was work done by Kate Allstadt, one of our colleagues working on this, using well-established methodology whereby long-period seismic data can be inverted to infer the sequence of forces that the landslide exerts on the Earth during the sequence of events. What Kate found, and she'll talk about this in detail in a talk in a few minutes, basically was evidence of this two-part onset scenario here with sort of two major sequences of acceleration and deceleration. And it was during this phase of acceleration here that high-frequency ground shaking began. And that seems to corroborate the idea that initially there was a fairly slow, fairly coherent landslide that was moving downslope, did not reach the river, and then what we believe happened after that is that because of destabilization of that upslope bluff, the upper bluff collapsed on top of that already unstable, very wet, very dilated mass, caused a big pulse of undrained loading, and that facilitated liquefaction of that debris and allowed the long run-out, high-speed behavior. There's abundant evidence of liquefaction in the landslide deposit itself. Not only is there that pervasively liquefied distal debris flow deposit, but within the debris avalanche part of the deposit, there are numerous sand boils. There are also larger features that we refer to as slosh pools, which are big pools of liquefied debris that seemingly oozed up from the base of the landslide. So we believe that the base of this debris avalanche was pervasively liquefied. And this is not unique. There are other examples worldwide of large debris avalanches liquefying their bases in cases that are well documented historical cases. A good example being the Ontake debris avalanche that occurred in Japan back in the 1980s. So in order to understand the role of liquefaction and its ramifications for mobility, we've modeled the event, and we did this initially during the first week following the event. And it's important to understand at least a bit of how the model works, and two of the important processes that are contained within the model equations, which Dave George will elaborate considerably in the next talk, are this process of contractive shearing and undrained compression. These are two well-known mechanisms by which landslides can liquefy. They've been produced experimentally. They're well understood. Contractive shearing occurs if you have sufficiently loosely packed debris such that when it shears, it contracts rather than dilates and thereby drives up the water pressure in the pore spaces. Undrained compression results when you have a load imposed on sufficiently wet material that it squeezes it like a sponge, attempts to squeeze the water out. The water can't escape on that same time scale, and so it pressurizes and allows liquefaction to occur. Both those processes are included in a mathematical model, computational model that we call Declaw, and all the details of that model were published in a paper just earlier this year. Two papers, I should say, earlier this year. So here's just a snapshot version of what Dave will talk about in considerably more detail in the next presentation. This shows the basic results from our Declaw simulations of the event, and actually two alternative simulations. Here's the initial configuration of the unstable debris at the top of the slope. Here's the floodplain in green. In one simulation, we assumed that there was no contractive deformation of the material, so that when it began to fail, there was no process by which the dynamics fed back during the movement itself to drive up the pore pressures dynamically. That results in a landslide that does occur. These landslides numerically were triggered by just gradually elevating the basal pore pressure as you would in a typical onset of landsliding. In the one scenario, without contraction, no liquefaction occurs, and you get a kind of an average behaving landslide that moves about 100 meters and then simply stops. So a landslide of this sort would have wreaked havoc of its own sort. It would have dammed the river, caused a lot of grief, but it would not have crossed the floodplain and killed 43 people in the process. On the other hand, if the initial conditions are such that the sediment is only slightly looser, allowing it to develop high pore pressures during the onset of motion and as a result of undrained loading, then the material liquefies spontaneously within several seconds of the onset of slope failure, and you get this high-speed run-out wherein 1 minute the landslide crosses the floodplain at an average speed of around 40 to 50 miles an hour, and then subsequently spreads laterally as the liquefied material continues to ooze outward. So a few basic inferences. First, about the sequence of events during the landslide. As I said, we believe that a lower segment of the slope, which very likely involved old landslide debris from the Hazel slide from 2006, moved first, but that initial phase of motion did not extend to the river. That then in turn caused debuttressing and collapse of upslope material. That upslope collapse facilitated liquefaction of the material downslope through undrained loading, and high-speed motion of the debris avalanche ensued. It lasted about 100 seconds based on the duration of high-frequency ground shaking. And the relatively small leading edge debris flow, which did a lot of the damage as it was being pushed forward by the debris avalanche, we believe attained a lot of its water from entraining about 50,000 cubic meters of water that was available in the North Fork Stillaguamish River when it was hit by the landslide. Regarding mobility, some further inferences. First of all, it simply wasn't an exceptionally mobile event. Others have contested that in print. It's still unclear to me how they've arrived at that conclusion that there was nothing unusual about this landslide, but they have made that assertion in some cases. The exceptional destructiveness of the debris avalanche or the debris avalanche flow arose from its mobility much more than it did from its size. The mobility can be attributed to basal liquefaction based both on modeling evidence and on field evidence. The modeling results indicate that if the landslide had occurred under slightly different initial conditions with slightly lower porosity, it would not have mobilized, would have been a far different outcome. And the fact that we can get such disparate landslide behaviors from slight differences in initial conditions is a rather sobering fact in view of what it implies for evaluation of landslide hazards. And it really reinforces the point that quantitative hazard evaluation is a very different business from simple hazard recognition. This is a case where almost every geologist recognized the landslide hazard at the site, but that was quite different from making a prediction of the sequence of events that unfolded. And then finally, I'll just close with an advertisement of sorts. We do have a paper on this that should be published within the next few weeks sometime, and that's a place where you can find further details if you're interested. Thank you.
We'll take one quick question as we're switching over.
We haven't, that's something that we can work out. We have the data available to do that, and we haven't actually done it yet. But I can say that, you know, to sort of one significant digit anyway, the H over L value, or the L over H value, well, I'll put it in terms of the H over L value would be about 0.2 roughly. So it's still quite a small value for a landslide of this size in particular.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker